Welcome everyone to the American Cetacean Society San Francisco Bay Chapter's July speaker event for 2023. I'm Susan Hopp, board member in charge of our speaker program, and I'm here with fellow board member Wade Cobb. For anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, we are a chapter within a national organization that is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and awarding grants towards cetacean research. We appreciate your donations in support of our mission. Donations fund our research grants to scientists, and they support our expenses around these monthly talks. And it's easy to donate on our website if you haven't donated at time of registration. So thank you. We are recording this session, and please put your questions in the Q&A. That's better than the chat. And after the presentation, we'll do our best to get to them. And now for our subject at hand. So as you all know, we are a chapter within the ACS national organization. And tonight we are introducing you to not only our speaker, but our current ACS president, Uko Gorter. And as you will hear and see, Uko is a person of many talents that I've learned for sure. So Uko was born in Arnhem, Holland, and after ending a 17-year career as a professional ballet dancer in 1997, he has pursued his career as a scientific illustrator. Uko specializes in marine mammals, and his work has appeared in scientific journals, museums, interpretive signage, and many books. The culmination of this work was illustrating all marine mammal species for the 2015 second edition of Marine Mammals of the World, a comprehensive guide to their identification. More recently, his work was featured in The Anatomy of Dolphins, Insights into Body Structure and Function, and the Encyclopedia of Whales, Dolphins, and Porpoises. He currently works on books on dolphin physiology. Uko joined the American Cetacean Society in 2002 and has been president since 2018. He's an avid historian and has amassed a large library of antiquarian books related to whales and whaling. And that brings us to tonight. Uko's taking us back to the mid-1800s to learn about the Forgotten Whale of Gräsö. So with that, Uko, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Wade, for thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me for the ACS San Francisco Bay chapter. Well, actually, since we're here, I want to make a plug for all the ACS chapters. As a president, I'm enthralled with all the chapters. All of us are volunteers. Wade also, and I go back in the screens. All of us were volunteers. We're doing this free. If this is in our free time, none of us are getting paid to do what we do. So it's a labor of love, it's passion. So if you're donating money too, it doesn't go to our salaries. I can assure you, to any of us. So it goes to programs, it goes to pay a lot of things that they have to be paid. So I thank you, Wade, and thank you for everyone, for all the chapters and the chapter board members for their service. So, okay. Let me then share my screen here and see if that works. Share. I'm going to play. Boom. There we are. Okay, of course, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Okay. That's it. Good. Yeah, the mid-19th century presented an interesting time with regards to science of whales and zoology in general. Not only did we see the groundbreaking publication by Charles Darwin on the origin of species in 1859, and a subsequent debate on evolution, it also represents a period in which we see a huge spike of new cetacean species being described. And even so, knowledge of whales was still very much in a confused state in this Victorian era, where egos often outcompeted each other. And in this backdrop, the scientific discovery and description of the living California gray whale happened while subfossil remains of an unknown whale were found on an island off the Swedish coast. And it took nearly a century before a link between these two was established. This is a tale of a forgotten population, brash and overzealous naturalists, and a whale that goes by many names. You can see them here in the slide here. So let me introduce you to the cast of characters. First and foremost, the gray whale itself. If you have a guidebook at home, any worth its salt, it would actually have not only the common name, gray we use here in the US, we use gray whale as a common name for this whale, and we have the binomial scientific name, which is it's made up of a genus. It's the Eschrichtius robustus, and then it's followed by the name of the author or authors who actually originally described the species, and then followed by a year, which means that is the year in which the description was published. If it's between parentheses, you see here, that means that the genus name was actually changed from the original, and we'll see all of that here unfold. The other main characters, some of you, or maybe, I think most of you will be familiar with Charles Melville's Scammon, who published a seminal publication in 1874 on the marine mammals of the northwest coast of America. Fantastic work. He was an American sea captain, whaling captain as well, although only for 10 years, but he is forever linked to the gray whale. The other person you may not be familiar with is Wilhelm Liliibork. Liliibork was a Swedish zoologist, professor of zoology in the University of Uppsala in Sweden. The other two characters here, these are some nasty characters in a way. Both John Edward Gray and Edward Drinker Cope. John Edward Gray was a British zoologist, keeper of zoology at the British Museum in England, in London, England. And Edward Drinker Cope was an American zoologist, paleontologist of the part of the Academy of Natural Sciences, Philadelphia. Both gentlemen were both brash, arrogant, quickly rushed to publish their findings, and wanted to be first. And Gray in particular has lots of cetacean species are named by him or after him. But these are sort of interesting characters here in the 18th century. There's a supporting cast here. Daniel Friedrich Schricht. You can probably see the name here. He is a Danish zoologist and an anatomist, and we'll talk obviously a little bit more about him as well. Paul Dudley is a colonial American, Attorney General of Massachusetts back then. He was also an amateur naturalist and often communicated with the Royal Society in London as he was a fellow there. Johan Christian Polycarp Erxleben, as a German naturalist. He was in the Age of Enlightenment, he was a compiler, but a physician, but also a professor of physics in the University of Göttingen in Germany. So there. Okay, gray whales in the North Pacific. Prior to the arrival of Euro-American whalers in the North Pacific, indigenous coastal communities were already quite familiar with the gray whale. A number of these communities actively hunted gray whales like the macaw, the Nurchanolth, and the Aleuts in what's now Alaska, and the Japanese, and some of this dating thousands and thousands of years. Then we have, commercial whaling came in the Pacific. As whales became scarcer in the Atlantic Ocean, Yankee and European whalers slowly moved their operations to the Pacific Ocean. The first whaling vessel to round Cape Horn was the British whaler Emilia out of London in 1789, owned by Enderby and Sons. Soon, American whalers followed in its wake. Whaling voyages had to be extended up to 5 or more years. Now, Yankee whaling ports out of Nantucket and New Bedford on the Atlantic side lost their prominence. Now the ports of Valparaiso in Chile and the Sandwich Island, now Hawaii, called Hawaii, and San Francisco grew in importance. Sperm whales were mainly targeted in the South Pacific and on the Line, which is the area around the equator. And in the North Pacific, whaling was primarily targeting the North Pacific right whale and the bowhead whale. Yeah, whaling in the Pacific, encountering the Scrag whale. As whalers began moving north to the North Pacific, they encountered gray whales, which they refer to as scrag whale. This was a term already in use in the early 1700s, meaning scrawny, undersized, or lean whales. It's a term that would eventually lead to considerable confusion by later scholars, as we will see later on. The first ship to conduct whaling along the California coast was the English whaler Resolution in 1795, but seemed to have ignored these scrag whales altogether. The first documented hunting of gray whales happened in the winter of 1845 and 46 in Magdalena Bay. The whaling ship Hibernia, the two from New London, Connecticut, caught 22 gray whales, whereas the bark United States from Stonington, Connecticut, caught 10. This heralded in a whole new area of interseasonal whaling, essentially with the one whaling in the Arctic could no longer be conducted. They moved south, and then this gray whaling was actually an interseasonal whaling, an opportunity in between the seasons. Yeah, San Francisco, California, 1850. So yeah, we are in San Francisco, huh? San Francisco, 1850, California is in a grip of the gold rush, which started in 1848 when gold was found in the Sierra foothills. It set off a mass migration of fortune seekers. Many Americans from the East Coast arrived by land, but also by ship, making the arduous journey around South America. Remember, the Panama Canal had not been built yet. One such ship was the bark Sarah Morse, which left Bath in Maine in August of 1849. The ship was skippered by a young 24 years old, confident Charles Melville Scammon. Neither he nor the ship had ever rounded Cape Horn, and Scammon had left his young pregnant wife Susan behind in Maine. The Sarah Morse finally reached San Francisco on February 21st of 1850. The scene upon arrival, as you see in this image, was chaotic. Many ships, including whaling ships, lay abandoned, anchored in the harbor as entire crews left for the hills in search of fortune. This left Scammon, who the consummate mariner who had no interest in pursuing gold, with the dilemma in finding employ to take the helm of a ship. And he took any opportunity that came along. In 1852, Scammon was put in charge of the brig Mary Helen and primarily caught elephant seals off the Californian coast. Scammon's first true whaling voyage occurred in 1853 and the 54 season when he commanded the bark Rio Grande. This journey took him to Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, and the Galapagos, and primarily targeted sperm whales and humpback whales. It was on the ship Leonor that Scammon visited Magdalena Bay in Baja California in the 1855 and 56 season. This may have been the first whaling journey that he caught a first gray whale, although there's no certainty. It was not until 1857 and 58 whaling season on the brig Boston, along with the schooner tender Marin, that Scammon discovered and entered the lagoons that would later bear his name. The lagoons are crucial for gray whales to give birth to their young, although it was extremely treacherous to enter the lagoons with large whaling vessels, but the risk paid off. This heralded in a period of whaling for which Charles Scammon is largely been associated with. In subsequent, more whaling vessels would follow, and it would prove to be disastrous for the gray whale. Scammon commanded his last whaling voyage on the ship William C. Nye in 1862 and 63 season. Although his whaling period spanned only about a decade out of a roughly 55-year maritime career, Scammon would forever be known as a whaling captain and associated with the California Rail. Scammon, it seems, as was quoted here in a book that I was read, a whaler by necessity, not by choice. Yet he was fascinated with the ocean's natural world, and he took copious notes and relished in observations made at sea. Scammon, the naturalist, would eventually emerge, but for now he would start a new chapter as part of the United States Revenue Marine, basically the precursors for the US Coast Guard. Okay, well, we'll meet up with Scammon later on, and we'll take you to Europe and to Sweden, to be more precise. And we'll see on the red arrow, it's a little island called Gräsö. That's a weird spelling, but that's Swedish, Gräsö. Yeah, in the summer of 1859, a Swedish zoologist named Johan Otto von Friesen visited Gräsö. Gräsö actually means grass island. So gräs is grass and ö is island, grass island, and entered the local Gräsö Kirka, the church, where he spotted a large vertebra, which was labeled Jätteben, or giant's bone. However, the newly installed pastor, Frederick August Hasselhun, who seemed only more enlightened by modern science, realized this was something very quite different. The pastor revealed that the bone was found in the 1840s by farmers digging in a ditch near the town of Norrboda, at the northern part of the island. Intrigued, von Friesen informed his friend and colleague in Uppsala, the zoologist Wilhelm Liliibork, who encouraged him to see if more bones could be found. The pastor gave von Friesen the exact location and permission from the farmer where the bone was found, and it was secured. Von Friesen, with help from farmhands, found a pair of vertebrae and a rib. And once the grain in the field was harvested later that summer, a second broader excavation revealed far more bones, like a scapula, cervical vertebrae, a mandible, forelimb, flipper bones, but the skull eluded them. The bones found about 840 feet from the seashore, along with the vertebra in the church, were donated to the Zoological Museum of the University in Uppsala. In October, 60 Liliibork arrived in Gräsö and made one more attempt to find the skull in a nearby field. However, no more bones could be found. Liliibork hypothesized that the cranial bones were likely swept away by the tides in this post-glacial period when the shoreline was higher. As Liliibork was unable to match the skeletal remains with any extant or species of Europe in European waters and seemingly unknown to science, he proposed to name it Balænoptera robusta, clearly thinking it was some kind of extinct rorqual whale from judging from the cervical vertebrae, mandible, sternum, and scapula, scapula in particular because of the chromion and these pieces that stick out, as you can see in the illustration. The usually strong developed bones earned it the name Robusta in this species. Liliibork would read his account on July 12 in 1860 in Copenhagen, and it was later published in the Forhandlinger vet Skandinaviske Naturforskers in 1861. Liliibork communicated his find with his friend and colleague, the British zoologist and keeper of the zoology at the British Museum in Natural History in London, John Edward Gray. Gray thought this whale was closer aligned to the humpback whale based on the round shape of the neurocanal and the cervical vertebrae, even though the scapula showed a well-defined acromion and coracoid process in the scapula, which are completely lacking in humpback whales. Something that made him pause and believe it may be something, possibly a genus distinct from both. He wasn't sure. Hence, he provisionally wrote Megaptera ? And then tentatively, and if you see the top of the, you'll see between brackets, you'll see a Schrichtius, maybe. He called it a subgenus of Schrichtius. Not long after John Edward Gray was visited by William Peggley, a British geologist and amateur archaeologist from Torquay in England. Peggley brought a bone donated to him. This cervical vertebrae was found near Babbacombe, or Babbacombe as it's called nowadays, in the vicinity of Torquay a few years earlier. Gray immediately recognized it as being similar to the Gräsö specimen and described by Wilhelm Liliibork. This time, Gray would read the account on the January 10th of 1865 for the Zoological Society of London and elevate the subgenus of Schrichtius to a full genus and proposed a Schrichtius robustus species here. And you'll see that actually it's a little pamphlet. It's actually even signed by Gray here. Gray gave the genus name in honor of his beloved colleague and the Danish zoologist Daniel Friedrich Eschricht, who had so suddenly died during an evening stroll in 1863. Eschricht was a preeminent and well-respected zoologist and anatomist. He made significant contributions to the science of whales, particularly with regarding of minke whales, humpback whales, and bottlenose whales. But he was best known for his work on bowhead whales, or Greenland whales as they were called back then, Schricht also made detailed anatomical embryological studies of these northern whale species. And lastly, through a collector friend in Iceland, Schricht built up an enormous collection of whale specimens now in the Natural History Museum in Denmark, Copenhagen. Meanwhile, Liliibork readily accepted Gray's new name and subsequently published a full account of the Gräsö specimen in Nova Acta in 1867, with detailed plates of all the bones that were collected at that point. Well, at this point, we will turn our focus back to Charles Melville Scammon in the North Pacific. As I mentioned, Scammon left whaling behind and became a captain in the United States Revenue Marine in 1863. This led him eventually to be in charge of the Western Union Telegraph Expedition in 1865. The task was to lay a telegraph cable from Fort McMichael in Alaska all the way to Providence Bay on the Russian mainland. It was on this trip that Scammon met a young 19-year-old Army lieutenant named William Healy Dahl. Yes, and the Dahl's porpoise is named after him, in case you wondered. Dahl was to be in charge of the civilian scientists on this expedition and responsible for the scientific collection destined for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Already Dahl had a reputation as a stellar scientist himself with excellent formal training. Dahl and Scammon hit it off quite well. Scammon fancied himself as a naturalist but lacked the formal education and was all too pleased with Dahl's company. Dahl provided a link to the scientific community that Scammon readily embraced. Scammon's depth of knowledge about whales sparked Dahl's interest, and it was he who would encourage Scammon to write scientific articles about the subject. In 1868, Scammon wrote a manuscript on the gray whale with a description, habits, and distribution. He showed it to Dahl, who suggested he would forward it to his mentor, Spencer Fullerton Beard, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution at that time. Upon receipt of Scammon's manuscript and introductory letter by Dahl, Beard sent it on to his colleague in Philadelphia. His name was Edward Drinker Cope, a young naturalist making his mark in the Academy of Natural Sciences, Philadelphia. Cope was not unlike his counterpart in London, John Edward Gray, as I mentioned earlier, a brash, arrogant zoologist who was eagerly rushed to publish his findings. Earlier, Cope had already received information from William Healy Dahl via Beard with regards to the gray whale specimens from Monterey whale fishery and a carcass mauled by killer whales, while at the same time seemingly unknown whale was cast ashore in Long Beach, New Jersey. He was informed that the whalers referred to it as scrag whale. Finding enough similarities between these specimens, Cope introduced a new genus for both, namely the Agaphallus. He would name the Agaphallus gibbosus for the New Jersey specimen based on the scrag whale, which described by earlier scholars, and we'll go on that in a minute. And then Agaphallus glaucus for the gray whale of the coast of California, described by William Healy Dahl. It was the first time that we see the term glaucus, which is Latin for gray and gray color. So this where the gray color comes in of the gray whale. Up to then, it was only named the name was used as gray whale just by the whalers of California. So yeah, now it's important for us to take a step further back in history and shine some light on the scrag whale moniker. What did it mean? Well, we see Cope referring both to Erxleben and Dudley with regards to the scrag whale. Indeed, the German naturalist Johan Christian Polycarp Erxleben introduces Balena gibbosa in his Systema Regnis Animalis, published in 1977. However, the scrag whale is at the bottom of his list of synonyms. You can see that here, the scrag whale. As a fact, actually, he doesn't even mention Dudley at all, only that it's in use by English speakers. The other problem is that Erxleben gives other synonyms in that list. Our species names may also be, that may actually refer to a number of whale species, including humpback whales. Erxleben was a compiler and indiscriminately copied from those who published before him, like Theodore Klein or Johan Andersen or Mathurin Jacques Brisson in France, to name a few. The first mention of the term scrag whale originates with Paul Dudley, the Attorney General of Massachusetts in colonial America, Dudley communicated his essay on the whales found off the coast of New England with the Royal Society of London in 1725. Here he introduces the scrag whale. The description somewhat matches the gray whale. However, the oil yield is closer to that of a right whale. And later scholars would cast enough doubt in this description and that hint that this term used by whalers could refer to a number of undersized whales. Right, well, Scammon finally saw his manuscript being published in 1869. However, Cope took a heavy hand, very heavy hand in editing this article. Not much of Scammon original manuscript survived intact. Cope ran away with the article and inserted his own notes. Once Scammon found out, he was furious and bitterly complained to Dahl. Cope would now seemingly abandon Agaphallus genus again and introduce a whole new genus for the California gray whale, namely the Rhachianectes, or their surf swimmer. In the Museum of the Geological Society of Cornwall, back in England, here now, some bones came to light in 1872, which were discovered some 40 years earlier, a half-mile from the present seashore near Pantawan, or Pantawan, present-day Pantawan in Cornwall. The zoologist Willie Henry Flower, then curator at the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, was given an opportunity to examine the bones, and Flower was able to match them with the Gräsö specimen that's described by Liliibork and aligned it with the Aschrictis robustus. Now, it was only until 1894 we have the first hint, the first ever person to hint at a direct link between the California gray whale and these European specimens was the British zoologist Richard Lydecker. First in 1894 in his encyclopedic work on the Royal Natural History, and again in 1906 in a commemorative work later in William Henry Flower. We can see here in the opinion of the present writer, and he was absolutely that he is convinced that the Rhachianectes glaucus is the same as these European species, and it should give the Aschrictis robustus, but he does not provide any kind of proof. That came much later. And that came until the 1930s. In 1935, whale bones were found in Wieringenmeer polder in Holland. These were just a polder that was actually just laid bare to dry and it became farmland. Professor Antonius van Dijnsen and Georg Junge wrote about this find and subsequent bone fragment from IJmuiden, which was near the coast, and already deposited at the Museum of Natural History in Leiden. They published their findings in 1937, but a careful comparison between these and earlier bones found in Sweden, England, and those of the California gray whale, they were the first to definitively prove that the bones were all of the same species. Thus, the extant or the living populations of gray whales in the North Pacific and the extinct population of the Atlantic gray whales. However, Van Dijnsen and Junge believed that Erxleben's Balena gibbosa was valid and had priority, and as such they proposed Aschrictis gibbosa. Yeah, and then finally, Sederland, Bror Sederland finally clears things up in 1938. A year later, 1938, Bror A. Sederland, a Swedish zoologist, was asked to investigate and settle the question once and for all with regards to the Gräsö specimen residing in Uppsala. Sederland published a very extremely detailed comparison between all the available gray whale material and agreed with Van Dijnsen and Junge that this was all one species. However, Sederland cast considerable doubt on both the identity of Dudley's scrag whale and Erxleben's account of Balena gibbosa. First, he notes that the scrag whale moniker was likely in use for a number of whale species of small size, and subsequently he states that Erxleben's list of synonyms his list of whales may belong to many different species. So yeah, we think this is the last word. Just as the dust had settled, one more name was accidentally perhaps introduced in the journal Arctic by William J. Maher in 1960. However, the definitive word came from Dale Rice and Alan Woolman in their important monograph of the gray whale in 1971. They agreed with Sederland. Both the extant gray whale in the North Pacific and the extinct Atlantic gray whale were of the same species, and Liliibork description had been proven to have priority. So now that it was established that the gray whale once roamed the North Atlantic, scholars eagerly pored over historical literature. This proved to be a daunting task, as no accounts were available, were able to definitively pinpoint to the identification of a gray whale. And whales were portrayed as monstrous fishes, as you see here. Yet there are few intriguing anecdotal accounts and images of interest. First was the Otsota in 1625. Thomas Edge, who led the Muscovy expedition to Greenland from England in 1611, which held in the British whaling in that period. They called the Greenland whale. He documents a whale called Otsota, and the description could possibly pertain. It's maybe, hopefully, it's, I know it might be hard to read here. The fourth sort of whale is called the Otsota. It's the same color as the trumpa. Trumpa actually refers to the sperm whale. And he has these fins in the mouth that are all white. So that could refer to a gray whale, but also probably to a minke whale. So there is still some, it's not definitive here. More interesting is the Icelandic scholar Johan Gudmundsson wrote an extensive treatise on the natural history of Iceland around the early 1640s, and a full chapter was dedicated to whales with illustrations. And one such whale was called the Sandligia, or Sandlier. It's a name actually that's still in use for the gray whales in Icelandic language. The illustration, however crude, does resemble a gray whale in the sense it doesn't have these knobby tail ends there. It just doesn't have a dorsal fin. Could someone have it here sort of separately drawn here? So it's very intriguing. A mysterious whale-like creature is depicted on a German broadside from 1709. It appears to be a whale stranded near Ystad in Sweden on the Baltic shore. Although often referred to as a humpback whale in recent literature, it may possibly be a gray whale. It does have that. Well, it may be, see if we can kind of combine it. There might be with these spots, but who knows? We'll likely never be sure. So yeah, here we are today. Our understanding of the gray whales have improved quite a bit since Scammon pursued its quarry, and scientifically. Looking at this range map, and I hope you can see it, we see the range of the living gray whale in the eastern North Pacific and the northern West Pacific, and these sort of light blue for the eastern North Pacific and the orange for the western whale, which there is seem to be, as of late, more mingling between individuals from either population. With regards to the North Atlantic, we see that since Liliibork's Gräsö specimen in Sweden, there have been countless other discoveries of gray whale subfossil specimens on either side of the North Atlantic. See these red dots? I hope you can see them. There's going to be much more now. There's really much work is already being done currently to solve the puzzle. What happened to the gray whale? Were they extirpated from through whaling? Were there other factors involved? It's beyond the scope of my presentation to delve into these questions, and there's certainly a lot of work being done currently to sort of hopefully answer these questions. So I will leave you a little bit of some suggested reading at the end here. An interesting development was the surprising visit of gray whales in the North Atlantic, in the North and even South Atlantic, yeah, all the way to Namibia in 2010 and 2013, and again in 2021. So these were all most likely whales from the North Pacific finding an ice-free passage through the Arctic. But it's fun to speculate if a new population will establish again in the North Atlantic at some point. We don't know, so they're very interesting. I'm going to leave you here with this image. This was provided here by a wonderful person. Ben Kerr is the curator in the museum in Uppsala. This is the holotype specimen of. This is the specimen that which the description by Wilhelm Liliibork was based on. So this is that specimen. No skull, all the mandibles. So these are all the bones you see here on this image, and you'll see the number on it. So if you ever wanted to go to Uppsala, you can visit it. You can visit the holotype specimen. In Uppsala is also the lecto specimen of the human being, of the Homo sapiens, which is Carl Linnaeus, who is buried in the cathedral there. He is the lectotype, so there might be worth a visit. So with that, I'm going to leave you here with some reading material that might be of interest to some of you. some books a bit older by Mary Lou Jones and Liz Schwartz, and Leatherwood, the Gray Whale is a phenomenal book. It's a little older now, but it's probably from the 1980s, but it's still worth a read. Wonderful book on Scammon, Beyond the Lagoon, really worthwhile read, actually, just fantastic book by Little Baker Landauer. Other books here too, I think by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, Gray Whales. Fantastic book now by Yuri van der Herk, who actually really wrote about these archaeological digs here, and certainly delving into the whole chapter on the gray whale. So worth, and you kind of read more about that. So that's a worthwhile. You probably can get you should be able to get the PDF. If not, I can actually get it to you. Wonderful book, again, I mentioned it earlier, by Dill Rice and Ellen Woolman, which is another a fantastic seminal work on gray whales. More recent was by James Sumich, Robusta, a fantastic book also by Stephen Schwartz, Lagoon Time, wonderful read. Another book here is by Men and Whales. It's an older book from 1972, I think. Men and Whales at Scammon's Lagoon by David A. Henderson. So these are just some of the books and things. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can do that, there you are, stop. Okay, try to do that. I think I stopped share. There we are. I'm back. We've all survived. Okay, I'm probably way early than probably usual, but that's okay.
All good. Yeah, thank you so much. That was amazing. We have a few questions that came in both through the Q&A, and I got a couple texts and emails and everything. If you wouldn't mind indulging.
Okay, let me just put that in the chat or the Q&A. Oh, the Q&A, actually, here we are. Okay.
Yeah. So the first one, we could start with, I have a few in email too, so maybe it makes sense to start with, I guess, in order of how they came through in the presentation.
Okay.
So the first couple are about the whaling trips themselves. So I guess one of them is kind of the duration. So how long would one of these trips have taken from like San Francisco around Cape Horn to Boston or to Europe?
Well, those whaling vessels that originated, let's say, from New Bedford, because after Nantucket, most of the Nantucket was first, and I think that became New Bedford became the harbor, because the ships had to be larger to go on larger trips. That'd be maybe from 1 year, 2 years. Once they rounded Cape Horn, these trips could take multiple years. They come up to 5 or even more years. But then, as I mentioned, some of these, the San Francisco and Valparaiso and Chile and Hawaii were also waypoints that grew in importance for whaling industry. So certainly in the late 1800s. So let's say from the 1860s all the way up to the 1870s and 1880s, when whaling sort of really kind of that Yankee whaling as we thinking of as the Moby Dick whaling type of thing. When that waned, of course, whaling had been, whaling happened before, as I mentioned, with the Nuchanoth and the Macaw, and the Japanese had whaled already along the shores way before that. Whaling, of course, was also conducted in Europe, maybe more opportunistically. The Basques, of course, started whaling in probably in the 10th century, maybe in around 900s or so. The Vikings, the Norse people, also maybe opportunistic, but there was certainly hints of whaling there. But hopefully that's maybe I go
Makes
off
sense.
On a tangent.
Yeah.
Maybe I go on a tangent.
No, that's great. And then as far as you covered the captains, but as far as the crew goes for those trips, could you kind of give some color on the typical kind of age, the social class they'd be coming from, that type of thing?
Well, I would certainly if you're looking at that classical Yankee whaling from the 1850s, you have to do read Moby Dick, for crying out loud. That actually gives you a wonderful flavor. It gives you a really good flavor of what it was like. It was the United Nations. They had really people from all over. There were African Americans or blacks who were employed there. There were people from Pacific Islanders. Think of Queequeg, and so those were there. So it was tough. It was certainly not. There is maybe sometimes a bit of a romantic thing, but it was extremely tough for these whaling voyages. But they have to work together. So there was some harmony to a degree, and obviously any kind of quarrels would be quelled rapidly. Many of the captains were typically Quakers but first in the beginning they came from the Nantucket, but also from New Bedford. So tough people, and so that's kind of that. But yeah, read Moby Dick if you haven't done that, for crying out. It's a wonderful book. It's a great read, and that gives you that flavor of whaling, that
Absolutely.
area. And then usually I think they had crews. Usually the crews were usually about 30 to 35 men or so, roughly.
And what was the boat size that they were looking at for the
Oh, they came big.
longer
They became
hauls?
bigger. Yeah, they became bigger and bigger. I'm not sure. Boy, may have been. It's 30, it might be 100 feet. I'm not sure. I'll be honest with you, and I'm not a whaling. So you'd have to look like you have to get some people in New Bedford. You have to invite someone from the whaling museum there. So they became bigger as they took larger. So these bricks were from even small two-mast schooners to all the way up to three-masted brigs with square sails. So but yeah, it's still cramped because they want to use a lot of room for their oil cask. And some of what are they? So what are their lamps? Yes, what's the whaling was done basically for oil. Obviously not meat, that was never been, but oil was for later, for certainly in the sperm whales, for candles, mostly for lighting. Up in the Arctic, they were going for after bowhead whales and right whales. And then the main thing was actually the baleen. The baleen was really the plastic of a day, was used for corset stays and all that kind of stuff. So that was very valuable. So at each time, certainly when sometimes the price of oil would actually, there'd be a glut of oil in the market, and much like you would see these days too, then there'd be other, but it's typically the baleen and the oil for candles, for lighting, for the machinery,
Makes sense. And I'm gonna botch the Swedish man's name, but did Liliibork live to see
Liliibork,
his theory? Liliibork, did he live to see his theory confirmed, or was that after his death?
Well, he never lived long enough to see that that his specimen, the Gräsö specimen, was indeed a gray whale, just aligned with the. And interestingly, Cope missed it, but it was totally off the mark. He missed it too. He did not make the link. He actually knew. Cope was interesting too, because he actually, it's one of these articles he wrote about the gray whale. He also writes he knew about Eschrichtus robustus because he used that name for a couple of specimens that were found on the shore of on the U.S. but none of those were actually valid. So they're different species. But so it's interesting. Cope was aware of the writings from what had John Edward Gray and Liliibork probably wrote, but did not really make the link there. So it's just amazing. It's taken so long before finally it's like, wait a minute, that's the same species. It took 70 years or over more than that to establish that, and without a doubt, anyway.
Well, and then we had a few questions about you and your story.
Oh.
So could you kind of walk through how you got on the path to this specific story? Like what kind of started your thinking to kind of tell this story, and where did your research take you?
Well, I gave a talk a few years ago on the cetology, on the dawn of cetology, the history of science, all the way from Aristotle down to kind of where we are today, essentially. And when you delve into that history, you find so many different side stories. You find something that is so compelling, at least to me anyway, maybe nerdy. See, I love all that stuff. So I love history. So I love all these little things. You can find something that, God, there's a whole story in that. And you often find it with writers. Graham D. Burnett wrote a wonderful story about whales in the 20s, whales, the science of whales in the 20th century. And so the reimagining of whales from commodities oils to totems of a counterculture and in its an environmental responsibility. And when he wrote that, he wrote a couple of other books that were related to that, just because he plucked out a few stories that sort of jumped out at him and that deserved a whole separate book. So obviously I'm not writing a book, not yet. Actually, I am writing with Thomas Jefferson. We're writing on the history of marine mammal research for a paper we're writing together. So that's something we're doing right now. Eventually, we're hoping that will culminate into when we're getting older and we have nothing else to do and we're sipping wine, and we want to write a book actually on the history of the science of whales. So really not just marine mammals, but just whales, particularly on cetaceans, because it is such a rich layered history. There's so much there. and also about the first women who came into this. So it's online. So if you can find my talk, you can see it. So yeah, the first women that come into science. There's a lot of interesting stuff. To me, that is just, yeah.
Do you spend most
Hopefully
of your...
that'll rub off to other people.
Absolutely. So do you spend most of your time now on kind of the research and history side of things, or are you still doing
no,
a lot of
most of the
illustrations
time
too?
I'm doing illustrations, and in between I read books, so I have lots of books to go through, and then you start the connections come, then the more books you read, it's like, oh, wait a minute, yes, it all falls into piece. Although it's that whole history is so rich, and there's so much also visual material. There's some wonderful books with plates and anatomy. For me as an illustrator, most of the works that I have only pertain to anatomy, and that's obviously more interested, but also in the early taxonomists. And yeah, Tom is the same way. Tom Jefferson, he's a nice collection of books. Yeah.
Do you get out into the field much, or are you mostly on the
I'm
research side of
landlocked.
things?
I'd be glad if I see a pileated woodpecker here in my back. So I'm not on the water all that much. It's not like I don't see people constantly. I look at Facebook and I see people constantly on the water. It's like, wow. First of all, I wouldn't have the money to constantly go out on a whale watch boat, and I don't have the time at this point. So, no, the opportunity is not here in Seattle. There's nothing really that's out there. Certainly, like you're more blessed, like if you're in Monterey, for instance, or San Diego, or in San Francisco, you certainly opportunities, far more opportunities going out on a whale. For me, I'd have to go to the San Juan Islands to do any kind of whale watching, but
Makes sense. I think we just got one more in the Q&A.
yeah, the gray show up in the North Atlantic. Yeah, that's right. If gray whales are,
So I'll read the question because I think
Sure,
that only
go
the
ahead.
panelists can see it. But so we have a question from Paula that said, I find myself wondering if grays show up again in the North Atlantic, would it be about the search for food because of the damage that humans have caused to the ocean? Yeah, that's about it. That would be
that is
reason
interesting.
for
I
us to
mean,
change.
yeah, I think many people have been speculating why would I assume it would be young whale. Looking at the images of the gray whales that we saw of Italy and Namibia too. The one in Namibia and South Africa actually seemed to be a pretty good, healthy animal. There were some Italian ones I couldn't quite see. I think I remember there was a little bit on the thinner side. So yeah, you wonder if they get anything to eat. But what would prompt them to go there? Obviously, they're constantly exploring. Animals do too. They find other opportunities. All animals try to do that. If there's more opportunities to go further, and if the Arctic is ice free, they'll continue further. And who knows? But there may be other whales out there we just haven't seen them. Maybe who knows around Greenland or Iceland and. Yeah, whether they get something to eat or they are adaptable to find other food sources. Gray whales can actually they're skim feeding, but they can also feed on the bottom. So there's, who knows? It's an interesting question. I don't think we don't know yet.
Makes sense. And I think that's all the questions that we have for today. Susan, I don't know if you have anything to add, but thank you so much. I know I've been firing some questions at you for a while. Really appreciate it.
All good, no problem. No,
I just have to ask Uko, going back to the title of your talk, did you visit Gräsö?
Gräsö, no, I have not visited. No, actually, I was supposed to go to Uppsala to see this specimen. I had made with Ben Kerr, who sent me. I had already arranged everything. I had my permit. I had to fill out a form that I was visiting. We had our trip arranged to Stockholm. We were going to Stockholm to Uppsala as well. I wanted to see the house where Linnaeus lives because I'm a big fan of Linnaeus. And then the pandemic hit. That was in 2021. Everything was booked already, so we had to cancel everything. Although, interestingly enough, Sweden actually did not close off. As one of the few European countries, they kind of didn't then have so it's odd. A strange experiment they did, the Swedes. But anyway, I was about to go, and I'm not sure if I would have gone to Gräsö necessarily. There isn't anything there. The actual whale is in Uppsala in the museum, so it's
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see the little the island. Yeah, I haven't. So, but I was close to. It nearly happened.
Well, there's probably still time, but
Yeah, I will
it
go
also-
back. Yeah.
yeah. And it also sounds like there's more opportunity to have you back with either what you're continuing to explore or that history of cetology. I think that sounds really pretty good too. So all
Yeah,
to
it's
say,
daunting.
I'll be in touch. We'll be in touch
Okay, sounds
for
good. Oh, good.
2024.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Anyway.
if people want to see your work, I think I found your website. It's just your first and last name.com.
Yeah. From there, of course, most of my work is I do everything digital on the computer, even though I took art courses where they strictly told me not to use computers. So, and then of course I did work with oils and acrylics and watercolors and now I do everything digital now, so it helps me. So but yeah, there's my work, some of work is there, but it's mostly in books and some museums, and so that's fun. So it's been all over the place. So and I'm working with scientists, so that's a wonderful thing too. It's not a job you make a lot of money, but then anything in the arts and science doesn't. If you want to make money, you're in the wrong business. I think if you're anything in science and arts, it's not happening, but it can be fulfilling. So it's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for
Thank you.
being here and for all the work you do. And on behalf of what brings us all together, here's to our beloved cetaceans.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it, and I as president too, I'm putting the other hat on too from Illustrator too. I'm thrilled to see what the chapters are doing. Also, the student groups, I need to check in with them as well. So it's tough. It's still coming out of the pandemic. I think I mentioned to you earlier, sort of offline here. Coming from the pandemic, it's hard for the ACS chapters to reimagine themselves how we're going to do this. I think all of you have done really well, and but it's hard because it takes up a lot of our time as board members and anyone is involved with the chapters too. It takes a lot of time to put into it, and not everybody has this. Things that life comes in between it, and that's life is always more important. Some stuff comes in between it. It's just this. So I'm grateful to everyone, to all the chapters and student groups, and putting all their time and effort in there. So and hopefully that enthusiasm rubs up to all of you who are watching. So become more involved any way you
Exactly.
can.
Yes, we
So
can always use more help.
we
and
use my prayer. Yeah,
we
if
have a
you're
great
in there's
community.
yeah.
So thank you all for being here. And all right, everyone, have a great summer night. See you soon.
Thank you.